Welcome, Bill. He is actually a newly minted assistant professor at Groningen University in Cambridge. He had his education at Rice University in Texas and finished his PhD at Penn, where I think we did cross paths at Penn.
We did.
I came and gave a talk about how the Kurds were never going to get a state at the end of the First World War, which is
I booked your train and your room for that. I
was
working at the Middle East Center at the time.
But then I didn't get to come. I had to do it by
That's
Zoom.
right. Yeah,
I had to do it. I didn't get my free trip to Pennsylvania, which is sad.
Got some bad news. I got some bad news for you. The credit for that trip that just went right back to the Middle East Center. We used that for somebody else.
Oh, milked for my knowledge. But that's academia in general. It's like It's a mugs game. You write like 1,500 words of trash, you can get like $500 for it. You write 10,000 words of 10,000 words of deeply researched stuff, you don't get paid anything, and they threaten to take your job away if you don't write it. That's how they keep you in check. Well, anyway, Bill is an expert on Sino-Iranian relations. He's written on the history of the Iranian left and its relationship with China. He is one of the rare individuals who's familiar with not one, but two Oriental languages. So he is a true Orientalist in the best sense of the word. He does both Middle and Far East. And hopefully down the road, we may have you back on if you enjoy yourself this time to talk more about the kind of historical aspects of China's relationship with Iran and the Iranian left. But today we wanted to focus on this kind of news that is floating around about China's increased involvement in the Middle East. Of course, we've had this recent agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was brokered by China. There's talk of a Chinese peace plan in Palestine. There's questions about, can China intervene meaningfully in Yemen? And then, of course, there's the question of investment and, what Iran and China's relationship is going to be economically. How does the Shanghai Organization figure into this? And what does this mean for the United States? And I think, when we talk about this topic, there is a kind of very interesting sort of similarity in position, if not in the normative values, between elements of the left and elements of the right, who are, the right are like, China is coming into the Middle East and stealing our lunch. We've got to push back on China, and that's a bad thing. And then there are people on the left who are like, no, China is like coming in. We're going towards this multipolar world. China is going to play a kind of a stabilizing force in the Middle East, whereas the United States has been a disruptive force, and that's a positive thing. And from what I've read, from what you've written, you're not really taking any kind of side in that kind of discussion, and rather talking about both the, let's say the quote unquote positive aspects of Chinese intervention, but also the fact that, some of this discussion about China becoming the guarantor of the Middle East and Middle Eastern stability is a little bit perhaps premature. So, before we get to the sort of questions about present day politics and these present day diplomatic maneuvers, can you perhaps talk a little bit about the recent history of China's relationship with Iran and also Saudi Arabia? What has been going on in the last, 20, 30 years in terms of China's involvement in the Middle East, especially since China sort of moved away from the more autarkic form of modernization towards integrating itself into the global economy. How has this impacted China's role in the Middle East?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I just want to say that somebody in the chat said that I look like a cross between Dave Grohl and David Cross, who had a son. That might be the best compliment I've ever gotten. So thank you, whoever you are.
I see it. I definitely see it.
So as to the history, yeah. So Iran and China's modern relationship started in the 1970s. It was a kind of interesting story in which, you know, a communist dictatorship has a relationship with a monarchy, which is not something that one might automatically expect, but at the time was very common in Chinese foreign policy, especially after the turn away from a more ideologically oriented foreign policy in some of the earlier eras, when they were partially looking at things through the lens of where in the region is ripe for revolution and where can we support groups that might overturn the governments there, to a more state-centered approach where they're focusing on relations between states, because fundamentally what they're after is the ascension in the UN. Basically, they're looking to get a critical mass of votes, amongst other things, but that's their main interest in the Middle East. The Middle East, like many other places, has many, many newly decolonized states, so there's a lot of people they can get on board with them, basically. So they approached China. I won't get into all of the details of that. It has a little bit to do with the attempts of some Iranian revolutionaries on the left, Maoists, who traveled to China, who were caught up in an assassination attempt against the Shah and were sort of subsequently blamed for that. And the Shah reached out to China partially as a way to kind of take the wind out of the sails of those Maoist opposition groups, who were making up the bulk of the most vocal and radical elements of the opposition at the time, at least until the death of Mao. It was a pretty successful strategy because subsequent to that, the Maoist movement in Iran kind of lost most of its success. After that, the two countries developed relations at a very low level, and it was actually in 1978 Deng Xiaoping visited, Hua Guofeng, who was Mao's successor, visited the Shah about, I think, 6 months before the revolution came. And this was at a time when it was extraordinarily obvious that the situation in Iran was not very good. The ambassador at the time, Hua Liming, he recalled a really interesting moment where they were supposed to go on this kind of like a limousine ride through the streets of Tehran, but they couldn't because there were crowds in the streets, chanting, my Shah and all that kind of stuff. And so they ended up having to take a helicopter to get to their destination. And when they got in the helicopter, there were actually 5 other helicopters that all flew off in different directions. So this is not the normal diplomatic protocol at the time. And it was really clear to the Chinese that this was not a stable situation. And they paid for this a little bit. Immediately after the revolution, the Islamic Republic was not interested in establishing relations with China. Khomeini said something like, the Chinese came and visited the Shah at a time when the streets were running red with the blood of the Iranian youth. So they had to sort of play against this for a while. But really, it was the Iran-Iraq war that brought China into Iran in a real way. Iran needed money and they needed weapons, and China was willing to provide them. And after the war, they played a very large role in the reconstruction effort. Famously, the Tehran Metro, for example, was built with Chinese engineers. After that, you had a period in which there's a kind of balancing act for China between its relations with the US and its relations with Iran. It goes up, it goes down. Generally speaking, China's interested in Iran as a piece of its overall strategy of engaging with countries in the Middle East and strategic locations around the world, but it's not a sort of center of gravity, so to speak. There's a number of times where China was buying oil from Iran, or China was offering to sell missiles to Iran, that subsequent to US pressure, those deals collapsed. Typically, you kind of see a sort of seesaw relationship where when relations between the US and China are not good, they're more willing to engage with Iran, because there's not as much of a political cost. If the political cost is basically, the US gets pissed off at you, well, they're already pissed off at us. So what's the cost of doing it? And you get the added benefit of, we're thumbing our noses, we're sticking our fingers in the eye of the empire, and, they don't want us to buy the oil. Well, we don't believe in sanctions. We're going to buy the oil. So this goes on for a while. And until you get to the kind of the modern era, where you start to really see, actually when I got into studying Iran and China was about 10 years ago. It was the first time, maybe 15 now. I like to think I'm less old than I am. It was really the first time in like the early 2000s that you started to hear about China and Iran in the same breath as this kind of like anti-Western, anti-US alliance, and in particular one that by purchasing Iranian oil, China was undermining US sanctions in the region, and et cetera, et cetera. Since then, there's been this sort of growing sense of crisis in Washington, this growing sense of this is like the new axis of evil. And that story, so to speak, really came to a head in 2021, when they signed the 25-year Iran-China strategic cooperation agreement that was widely said to be, worth $400 billion. I'm here to tell you today that that number is found nowhere in any of the documentation. And since that deal has been signed, there's been something like $145 million of investment in Iran. So they're not really on track, I don't think, to make $400 billion in 25 years. And that kind of brings me to the point about contemporary relations, is that while the rhetoric and in fact sometimes what the governments say is very positive towards Sino-Iranian relations, in reality, the Chinese are not super keen on investing and spending a lot of money in Iran, at least not in ways that don't benefit or they are interested in ways that benefit them, but they're not interested in ways that expose them to risk. So they're willing to improve trade relations with Iran. Iran has become sort of flooded in a lot of ways with Chinese products. Chinese cars actually recently is kind of the new thing. But they're not really willing to invest. And it's pretty obvious why. I mean, the sanctions make it really difficult, especially after, for example, the arrest Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, who was arrested in Canada on charges related to evading the sanctions in Iran. So there's this tension between the desire of China to engage with Iran in a way that is beneficial to their sort of overall strategy, and the desire on the part of Iran to look to China, the Negah Besharq strategy, the look to the East strategy, as a kind of savior, right? We can't look to the West; we have to look to the East. They can buy our oil; they can pull us out of this this quagmire that we're in terms of our political situation. I think it's a bit overblown. Like you said, I'm not really taking a position in the sense that if the two positions are the sky is falling and that's terrible, and the sky is falling and that's not, and that's great. I'm here to tell you the sky's probably not coming down as quickly as you think it might be. So that's where I think things remain to this day. China is very important to Iran. Iran is not as important to China, and China is not investing in Iran as heavily as they would like and as much as they expected after the signing of several of those deals over the last few years.
So, what you're saying is while China might be interested in working with Iran, there are just better markets for them to invest in, ones with less, that are going to bring about less problems for them. Is that, they're not willing to go to bat to support Iran at the moment, because that might foreclose other opportunities around the world.
Exactly. I mean, that's exactly the biggest problem is why would you invest in Iran when Saudi Arabia is right next door, where you can get the same kinds of deals in a country, and also, all of the Gulf countries, most of the GCC has stronger legal regimes, the legal protections, more developed financial services, technology. I mean, Huawei and ZTE both have headquarters in the Middle East, and they are located in, I believe, the UAE and Bahrain, respectively. And so there's a lot of attraction to the GCC, not so much to Iran.
Right. So China's orientation is generally towards these more, let's say, open markets in the Middle East. Countries which have been generally pro-American, but are pursuing more independent foreign policies at the moment, have some leverage over the United States to a certain degree. And so the reaction from the United States to, let's say, investing in the Gulf is going to be less, and there's more opportunities for China to secure the resources that it wants, which is the oil. So there is perhaps a will to invest in China, but that will is not strong enough, let's say, to overcome the risks. As you said, they don't want to, China, and I think this is a point that we've talked about before. China, is quite, conservative, or we could say responsible when it comes to its engagement in the international arena, and they are not trying to get themselves into anything that could blow back on them in a significant way.
Yeah, and certainly more so than the United States in terms of how they've behaved towards Middle Eastern countries and how they've participated in various conflicts. I mean, the worst you can really say in the story that I'm telling is that, Iran sold weapons to both sides during the China sold weapons to both sides during the Iran-Iraq war, but so did the United States and Russia, and they did so at a much greater volume. So I do generally see China as more likely to play a stabilizing role. It's certainly not, I wouldn't say that it's actively stabilizing things, but it's certainly not a destabilizing factor.
Bill, I wanted to ask you, do you think that part of the motivation that China may have for actually getting into some level of interaction with Iran may be around the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative? Do you think that there's any justification whatsoever that China would have in wanting to invest in Iran? Or what reciprocation could Iran see itself in having benefit from China being involved in its development? Is there anything that we might be missing here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, the Belt and Road Initiative, it's important to remember, it is like many Chinese initiatives, it is a kind of, it's a blank slate, an empty container that you can kind of pour anything into. Many of the Belt and Road projects that we see today were already happening. And when they came up with the concept of Belt and Road, and they kind of just built it around that. So there is an overarching strategy of engaging with all of these countries in the world, but it's not as directed or part of sort of a larger big picture. It's more of a big picture strategy than like an individual. Okay, first we're going to do this, and then we're going to go there. In terms of what China wants to get out of Iran. Oil obviously is a big one, but like we said, they can get that elsewhere. Their interests are more towards, I think, Iran as a potential market. It's a great market for Chinese goods. It's also one that's relatively easy for them to get into because the West has largely excluded itself from that market. Although there are problems with that because the Iranians themselves have a very clearly stated preference for European products. In fact, so much so that part of the negative debate about China, relations with China in Iran is that Iranians sort of say, 20 years ago, we had access to, the best European products and things like that. And now we have nothing but cheap Chinese crap on all of the mall shelves, so it kind of highlights this sense of we are not living up to our potential. We deserve more than this. We shouldn't have to deal with this because the government's policies are, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a common complaint on the reformist side, for example. But in terms of what Iran can get out of this, it's Iran lacks the capacity to complete a lot of investment projects that could be developed. There's a lot of oil, a lot of gas, and also just domestic manufacturing that could be built up with Chinese investment, and they simply lack the sources of development capital. And it's not only China that can provide that. Right now, actually, Russia is the #1 investor in Iran. And since the normalization deal, one of the big things they've discussed is bringing in Saudi Arabia and the Saudi Investment Fund to finance projects in Iran. So it really just comes down to they have things they could do, but they lack the money or the expertise to do it. And China is one of the things that could provide that.